back to The Force and Freedom. Last time we saw that Han and Obi-Wan disagree about how to face fear. They discuss their disagreement while Luke trains with a lightsaber, and then immediately after, their disagreement is illustrated in an encounter with a TIE fighter. Han thinks they should blow it up. Obi-Wan thinks there's something fishy, and they better let it go. And then we saw that throughout the Death Star scenes, Han consistently wants to solve problems with guns, and Luke and Leia, on the other hand, show a kind of Jedi openness to alternatives. The Jedi idea is that there are things that hold our lives together and control our destinies. Lucas said, "I have come to the conclusion that there is a force larger than the individual. It is controlled by the individuals, and it controls them. All I'm saying is that the pure soul is connected to a larger energy field that you would begin to understand if you went all the way back and saw yourself in the purest sense." What the Jedi do is get in touch with these broader patterns that hold our lives together and control our destinies. Since these patterns determine how we each act and behave, awareness of these patterns can give us control of ourselves and others. Luke and Leia are able to figure out how to get through the Death Star because they understand how Death Star life has to operate. Space stations need garbage rooms, and garbage compactors need controls. When Obi-Wan scares away the Sand People, it's similarly based on an awareness of their way of life, of who their predators are, and how they react to signs of them. When he uses his Jedi mind trick, he's acting on his awareness of the way that a certain kind of psychology holds imperial hierarchies together. He knows just what stormtroopers respond to: orders. Why does the mind trick work? Because stormtroopers take orders. That's what they're trained to do. It's not just a mystical power that allows Obi-Wan to get past the stormtroopers. It's that he understands who he's dealing with, and he can see how to change the terms of engagement by putting on an authoritative tone of voice. Of course, the Force is also a mystical power, and it makes possible things that would be impossible in our world. But the core idea is that using the Force is tapping into an awareness of the laws of the universe. And Han rejects this. Han says,
"There's no mystical energy field controls my destiny."
Han is an individualist in a deep sense. He doesn't see himself and his actions as the product of laws, mystical or otherwise.
Great. I take orders from just one person, me.
So wonder you're still alive.
But that's a skewed self-understanding. Living beings thrive on a give-and-take relationship with their environment, and the Jedi learn to sense the give-and-take relationships in an environment and work with them. Remember that the lesson we learned from Rousseau was that you can be your own master in society with others by coming to an agreement on the laws. But if you're expecting to take orders only from yourself without regard for those around you, good luck. If Luke and Leia seemed like good creative problem solvers, they're mere apprentices compared to Obi-Wan. In some early notes, Lucas described Obi-Wan as having the James Bond-like quality of always being in control. He's very sure of himself and always comes out ahead, regardless of the danger. Aboard the Death Star, Obi-Wan doesn't need to find clever ways to escape the stormtroopers, because he makes sure they never find him. While Luke and Leia are desperately thinking up ways out of jams, Obi-Wan has such a refined awareness of the possibilities open to him that he avoids violence entirely. He wanders freely about the Death Star without being noticed, until he encounters Vader. It's hard to tell whether Vader's command of the Force has allowed him to catch up with Obi-Wan, or whether Obi-Wan has allowed himself to be captured.
Escape is not his plan.
We're going to see that Vader and Obi-Wan are always a few steps ahead of where they seem to be in their lightsaber duel. But before we get to the duel, it's worth mentioning that in itself, the lightsaber already represents the Jedi's determination to take control of the terms of engagement. It's a completely different kind of weapon from a blaster. It requires a different set of skills, and it generates a different kind of fight. When introducing the lightsaber to Luke, Obi-Wan describes it as a weapon out of step with the times.
An elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
You don't choose a lightsaber because that's what other people are doing. When you choose a blaster, you're choosing to accept the terms of an uncivilized age. But when you choose the lightsaber, you're choosing a very different way of engaging with your enemy. You also don't choose the lightsaber because it's obviously better for dispatching your opponents. It has obvious limitations compared to a blaster. You won't be able to shoot first like Han. You choose it because it gives you control.
Not as clumsy or random as a blaster.
The laser bolt of a blaster, once flown, is out of my control. But the laser beam of a lightsaber always answers to its wielder's hands. The lightsaber is for someone who values control more than destructive power. The first lightsaber battle of Star Wars is not the most visually stunning, but in a way that's entirely appropriate, because the real battle in this case is not the battle fought with lightsabers. It's a battle of wits. Vader initiates this mental battle by taunting Obi-Wan as he lures him into the fight.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
These words are calculated to offend Obi-Wan, to hurt his pride. The natural reaction is for Obi-Wan to try to outfight Vader, to prove that he, Obi-Wan, is still the master, that he still has something to teach Vader. In other words, Vader is trying to set the terms. He's trying to make the confrontation a duel to prove who's the master, because he thinks those terms are favorable to him. Now, Obi-Wan does accept the duel, but not in the spirit that Vader intends. He isn't really trying to beat Vader. In fact, he deliberately loses in the end. He's using the duel to achieve his own ends, first, freeing his friends. If you watch the duel carefully, you'll see that Obi-Wan pivots around Vader, positioning himself on the opposite side he starts from, and then he starts to back up, luring Vader to the doorway. Why? Maybe he's trying to get away. But remember that Vader had earlier told us that escape is not his plan. He seems to have something else in mind. From the doorway where he stops his retreat, he can be seen by all the stormtroopers in the hangar. And the stormtroopers, enticed by the flashing dance of the lightsabers, abandon their post to get a closer look, leaving the heroes with an open path to the Millennium Falcon. Vader wanted to make the duel about who's better with a lightsaber. But Obi-Wan has other priorities, and he sticks to them. He's fighting Vader not to prove that he's the master, but to help his friends reach their ship. But Vader's strong in the Force too. Obi-Wan may have created a diversion so his friends could get to the Falcon, but Vader had already planted a tracking device on the Falcon. He wants them to get away so they can lead him to the Rebel base. So perhaps Vader is one step ahead of Obi-Wan. But Obi-Wan has a second goal beyond the diversion, as we can see in the knowing look he directs towards Luke before he gives up the ghost. He's going to make himself a martyr to inspire the cause.
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
The thought is that Obi-Wan's death will do more to inspire Luke and the rebels than his life would. And here I think we see a Jedi insight that goes beyond simply thinking outside the box to set the terms of engagement. One of the Jedi insights, one that Vader seems to lack, is that if you're willing to give yourself up, you gain greater control of the situation. Obi-Wan is fighting a losing battle against a younger, stronger opponent. As long as Obi-Wan assumes that the task before him is to defend his honor as a Jedi Master, or even to find a way to survive, he's trapped. But Obi-Wan doesn't assume that he needs to survive. He realizes that his life is less important to the cause than Luke's, and that seeing his death will inspire Luke, so he lets go. Taking a step into a broader world doesn't just mean seeing alternative ways of getting what you want. It also means reevaluating the importance of what you want. Vader is trying to get Obi-Wan to define the situation in terms of his identity as a Jedi Knight, a Master Warrior. That identity is under threat, and the natural reaction is to defend it. But Obi-Wan doesn't let concern for his identity as a warrior, or even for his life, get in the way of seeing the possibility of saving some friends and a cause. The point here is that if you don't let your sense of yourself and of your importance blind you to possibilities, if you're willing to let go of yourself and ally yourself with a greater cause, you can find a measure of meaningful freedom even when your choices are very narrowly constrained. So maybe Obi-Wan was one step ahead of Vader after all. Think back to Obi-Wan's talk of letting go one's conscious self, of letting the Force control one's actions, of stepping into a larger world. A lot of the time, what blinds us to our possibilities are deeply rooted assumptions about ourselves and our importance. This may all sound paradoxical. How is Obi-Wan more free in giving up on his desire to save his own life? Isn't Vader the one forcing him to give up on this goal? So how is he not subject to Vader's will? It's certainly true that Vader is limiting Obi-Wan's freedom at this moment. Obi-Wan can't have everything because Vader is in his way. Ideally, Obi-Wan would help his friends escape, inspire Luke, and also escape with them. But while Vader is succeeding at limiting Obi-Wan's options, he isn't controlling Obi-Wan the way he wants to. He isn't succeeding at getting Obi-Wan to invest in the fight as a test of who's master. He wants this to be a humiliation for Obi-Wan. He wants this to be intimidating for any onlookers, proof that Obi-Wan is weak, and that resistance to the Empire is futile. But to accomplish that, he needs Obi-Wan to be trying his hardest and losing in spite of it. Instead, Obi-Wan gives Luke a knowing look and refuses to defend himself anymore. And then he disappears, leaving even Vader flummoxed about what's happened. He completely robs Vader of his moment. So although Vader imposes limits on Obi-Wan's options, he doesn't manage to dictate Obi-Wan's actions to him the way that the Empire dictates actions to those who are afraid of them. Obi-Wan's self-abnegation doesn't give him the freedom to get whatever he wants, though he has a lot more of that kind of freedom than most people because he's so good at negotiating the terms of engagement. The freedom that Obi-Wan's self-abnegation gives him is the freedom from having his actions dictated to him by threats of violence and domination. The freedom from having Vader control his actions. Gilbert Murray once wrote, "Be careful in dealing with a man who cares nothing for sensual pleasures, nothing for comfort or praise or promotion, but is simply determined to do what he believes is right. He is a dangerous and uncomfortable enemy because his body, which you can always conquer, gives you so little purchase on his soul." Of course, if you just do care about sensual pleasures, praise, and promotion, about preserving your own life or being the best with a lightsaber, being forced to give up these things will always be a limitation on your freedom. And if you only care about these things and someone threatens to take them away and you can't find a way around their threat, then you won't have this freedom. People who care about something that others are able to take away from them will always be vulnerable to those others. It just so happens that Obi-Wan cares about something much bigger than himself, and hence harder to take away from him, and so it's harder for Vader to get a lever on him. And Obi-Wan's refusal to defend himself sends a powerful message. The Empire can't make you do anything. They can kill you, but they can't control your actions unless you let them. They can't keep the systems in line without the fear of this battle station, and you can choose whether to be afraid. When Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, Mohandas Gandhi wrote, "If the Abyssinians had adopted the attitude of nonviolence of the strong, that is, the nonviolence which breaks to pieces but never bends, Mussolini would have had no interest in Abyssinia. Thus, if they had simply said, 'You're welcome to reduce us to dust and ashes, but you will not find one Abyssinian ready to cooperate with you,' what would Mussolini have done? He didn't want a desert." In one 1987 interview, George Lucas emphasized the application of these Jedi principles to technology. He said, "When I made graffiti, I was 23 years old. I was very aware of the changes taking place around me as I was growing up, and I loved it. But at the same time, it was sad. I was kind of nostalgic for the loss of youth, I guess. But that's the point. Things change. Life goes on. Life is a constant transition, and you have to accept that fact. The film is all about the fact that you can't hang on to the past. The future may be completely strange and different and scary, but that's the way it should be. I thought that was one of the biggest challenges facing teenagers. I got to do what I wanted to do by not being frightened away by the future and the unknown. And I figured that was a good message to get across. Star Wars says the same thing in terms of technology, spaceflight, and opening up the world. The idea is not to be afraid of change. Star Wars shows progression. You may be frightened, and it's sad because you're leaving something behind, but go forward. That's what life is about. You can either have a good attitude about change or a bad attitude about it. You can't fight tidal waves, you can only ride them. So the best thing to do is get your surfboard and make the best of it. The Force is what happens in spite of us that we can either use or not use. We can fight these changes or we can use them, incorporate them into our lives, take full advantage of them. The opposing view is the nostalgic notion I was talking about, fear of change. I don't want to lose myself in the greater ocean of humanity. Kick and scream all you want, but that's the way things are going. So notice the language Lucas is using here. The problem is fear of change. And in particular, what kind of change? I don't want to lose myself in the greater ocean of humanity. It's a fear of self-loss. That's the opposite of the Jedi message. You can see why Han and Obi-Wan are in such stark disagreement. Fear of self-loss is Han's primary motivation. The thought is that you have to let go of the world you thought you knew, let go of the self you were attached to, and accept how things are. And when you do, that empowers you, and it gives you some control over your situation. Now, this Jedi strategy wasn't just something that Lucas made up for the movies. Remember from our last episode that Lucas was living these problems. He was living under freedom-limiting empires. The studios controlled the terms under which films were being made, and Lucas wasn't happy with those terms. In response, Lucas managed to do a Jedi trick of his own. Broadly speaking, there have been two main approaches for filmmakers to make a movie. On the one hand, you can make a movie for the studios. They provide the budget and you make your movie, but they usually keep a lot of control of the final product because they want to make sure they can earn something on their investment. On the other hand, you could forego the studio money and try to gather money on your own, make an independent film. It's going to be difficult to get anything like the kind of money you could get for a studio film. And that's going to mean that if you're an independent filmmaker, you're going to be much more limited in the sorts of things you can do, especially back before digital technology had made it so affordable to make all sorts of movies. Lucas once said, "After THX, I realized I had to make entertaining films or back off and release through libraries. I didn't want to struggle to get $3,000. It was too limiting, like giving a painter one brush, a piece of hardboard, and tubes of black and white paint. You can do it, but I didn't want to be a self-indulgent artist, and I didn't want my wife to support me forever." So Lucas seems to have opted for the studio strategy. Now, of course, these weren't the only two possibilities. There were hybrid approaches. Some people would work for the studios to get money so they could use that money to finance their own projects. Orson Welles was famous for this sort of thing. He'd start filming his independent film, and then he'd run out of money. So he'd go back to Hollywood and do some acting to get some more money so he could keep filming. In the most extreme case, The Other Side of the Wind, it actually took him almost 6 years to complete the filming because he kept running out of money and having to pause the filmmaking so he could go look for more money. George Lucas did something very clever. He didn't take either of the standard approaches exactly, or even the hybrid approach Orson Welles used. He out-studioed the studios by approaching the studios like a businessman rather than like an artist. Coming fresh off his first commercial success, American Graffiti, he was in a position to demand more money. But he didn't demand more money. Instead, he demanded two things that most directors didn't want or didn't think to demand. First, he demanded merchandise rights. And at the time, merchandise rights were garbage rights. Nobody was making money off the merchandise. Lucas said, "We found Fox was giving away merchandising rights just for the publicity. They gave away tie-in promotions with a big fast food chain. They were actually paying these people to do this big campaign for them. We told them that was insane. I simply said, I'm going to be able to make t-shirts, I'm going to be able to make posters, and I'm going to be able to sell this movie even though the studios won't. I'm going to make 5 times as much money as Francis on these science fiction toys, and I won't have to make The Godfather." So Lucas realized that if Star Wars turned out the way he hoped it would, he could make a lot of money selling toys and t-shirts, and that money would help set him free from the studios in the future. Which brings me to the second thing that he asked for, sequel rights. The studio was slow to concede these, but when it came down to it, the sequel rights were only going to be worth something if the original movie was successful, which wasn't a guarantee. And even if Lucas had sequel rights, he was probably going to need studio money to make a sequel with. So he was probably going to come back to the studio for the second movie anyway. Which he did, but not for nearly as much money as you would have thought because he made so much money from the first movie and the merchandise that he was able to finance it mostly by himself. And remember that this was an era when franchises weren't really a thing. Sequels rarely made money, even if the first one did. In fact, Lucas's own first sequel, More American Graffiti, was a total bomb in spite of the original's massive success and the star power of Harrison Ford, Ron Howard, and Cindy Williams. But the goal of the whole franchise was to make enough money that Lucas would be forever free from the studios. And that's part of why having the sequel rights was so important. Because if he ever needed any more money to finance any of the independent art films he was planning to make, all he needed to do was make another Star Wars movie. I might as well mention here that I don't think that the fact that Lucas wanted to make money is in any conflict with my claim that he wanted to make a movie about freedom, any more than I think it's in conflict with the idea that Star Wars is about coming of age and the hero's journey. Part of what makes Star Wars such a fantastic achievement is that it does all these things at once. In a 1994 interview, Lucas said, "Fortunately, I'm smart enough as a businessman to remain independent. And the reason that I've put the effort in to remain independent, to keep my facility in San Francisco and not be dictated to by the studios, is because I want to tell my own story. I don't want a bunch of people coming in trying to figure out what the market wants. I just like to do what I like to do." So what Lucas did with the studios in getting the merchandising and sequel rights is quite literally change the terms of engagement. Lucas said, "It changed the whole nature of the deal. Nobody had expected that. And when the tables got turned and the same system worked against them, they felt betrayed and cheated." Steven Spielberg said, If you're an executive, suddenly you realize that if you're going to go into business with George Lucas, you're no longer in the 20th Century Fox business. You're in the George Lucas business. And George is going to call every shot. Of course, it depended on a lot of luck. And if the movie hadn't been as successful as it was, it wouldn't have gotten him his independence. But that simple change in terms ended up setting him completely free of the studios by the time of Return of the Jedi. One Fox executive later remarked, "George was enormously farsighted, and the studio wasn't, because they didn't know the world was changing. George did know the world was changing. I mean, he changed it." The changing world controlled George's actions, but it also obeyed his commands. And I think it's worth remembering that Lucas couldn't have pulled this off if he had been terribly concerned about a certain kind of identity. Lucas was known for making art films at the time, and filmmakers took his previous work seriously in a way that they didn't take Star Wars. Just as Obi-Wan needed to resist the temptation to defend his identity as the Master Jedi, so Lucas needed to be willing to give up his identity as an art film director to be able to do what he wanted to do. You have to remember that Lucas developed Star Wars in the era of the New Hollywood, which produced a lot of, as he described them, angry, socially relevant films. And Lucas was a part of this. This was what THX 1138 was all about. And having been a part of that movement, Lucas took some flack for turning to this more light-hearted, fun style that most people didn't take very seriously. Director William Friedkin said, "Star Wars swept all the chips off the table. What happened with Star Wars was like when McDonald's got a foothold. The taste for good food just disappeared." Even Lawrence Kasdan, who co-wrote The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, said, "I'm not saying it's George's fault, but he and Steven Spielberg changed every studio's idea of what a movie should do in terms of investment versus return. It ruined the modest expectations of the movie business. Now every studio film is designed to be a blockbuster." And there are people who are bitter towards Star Wars to this day for having contributed to a trend away from the New Hollywood and towards the blockbuster. Not too long ago, Louis Menand wrote, "Movie critics who got into the business in the days of Godard and Altman and the early Scorsese now find themselves chained to a life of appraising the cinematic qualities of pictures designed for kids, and promoted in advance of their release in ways that make reviewers, when they finally do cast their votes, almost irrelevant. If critics hold Lucas responsible for this state of affairs, they're not wrong. For whatever else its cultural meaning may be, Star Wars did change the movie business." Rick Perlstein writes, "Why are we celebrating this franchise in the worshipful way we are, when it contributed so materially to turning us into a nation of 8-year-olds? He gave us permission to stop growing up." Now, it's only fair to acknowledge that although Lucas himself had a reputation for making art films, he was suspicious of that label. When the New York Times hailed American Graffiti as a work of art, Lucas said, "I don't think of myself as an artist, and I don't think I ever will. I'm a craftsman. I don't make a work of art. I make a movie. If it does what I want it to do, then somebody else can come along and figure it out." But for years afterwards, Lucas kept talking about returning to his abstract films. So it seems that he agrees that he left something behind. And maybe he's still got some abstract films left in him. But just as Obi-Wan needed to set aside his identity as the Master Jedi to get his friends to safety, so too Lucas needed to set aside his identity as the art film director in order to get the kind of freedom he wanted from the studios. Okay. So we've seen two kinds of response to fear, and they've each had some success aboard the Death Star, although Obi-Wan seems to have shown the superiority of the Jedi approach that he teaches. But there's one last test, the battle against the Death Star. There's an obvious symbolism in this last battle. It's not a fight between two battle stations or a battle station and the biggest ship the rebels can muster. It's a battle between a battle station and a bunch of individual freedom fighters. It's about the power of the individual to resist a social or political order that doesn't respect individual freedom. And individuals have that power in part because such orders tend to underestimate the power of the individual.
Well, the Empire doesn't consider a small one-man fighter to be any threat, or they'd have a tighter defense.
When the final battle comes, Han runs away, and not just because he doesn't see enough in it for him. He doesn't think they can win.
Besides, attacking that battle station ain't my idea of courage. It's more like suicide.
For Han, this is a losing battle. He can't imagine a way of winning against such a powerful force. But Luke and the rebels see a possibility where Han sees none. The Death Star is built to resist large-scale assault, not individual fighters. Now, what better way to represent the fight for freedom against gargantuan empires than to have the freedom fighters each pilot their own ship, make their own decisions? What they lack in firepower, they make up for with their individuality, their creativity, and their unpredictability. The bureaucracy of the Empire is too rigid to respond effectively to this kind of fighting. There's a line that Mark Hamill remembers from an earlier draft of the script used at his audition. Luke says to the rebels, "We can't turn around. Fear is their greatest weapon. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Aquila or Sullust, and what there is most likely directed toward a large-scale assault." In other words, what's actually deterring people from overthrowing the Empire is not the Empire's defenses. Those aren't strong enough to stop determined freedom fighters. What's deterring them is fear. And this is where the limits of Han's approach, I think, really become evident. Han may not be guided by an emotion of fear, but when he says that attacking the Death Star isn't his idea of courage, he's showing us that he's letting the threat of the Death Star dominate his thinking. And so Han, too, in a way, seems to be giving in to fear. Lucas said in one interview that one of the messages of his films is, don't listen to everyone else. Discover your own feelings and follow them. Then you can overcome anything. It's the one thing I discovered early on. You may have to overcome a lot of fear and get up a lot of courage. Sometimes to do even the simplest things. Sometimes to just get up in the morning. But you can do it. You can make a difference. Dreams are extremely important. You can't do it unless you imagine it. The idea is not too different from how Lucas once described THX 1138. He said, "The plot was a vehicle for the theme, and the theme is basically existential, the importance of self and being able to step out of whatever you're in and move forward rather than being stuck in your little rut. People would give anything to quit their jobs. All they have to do is do it. People would give anything for a divorce, and there's nothing stopping them. They're people in cages with open doors." But interestingly, the actual climax of this film is more ambiguous. Luke is racing down a channel, walled in on 3 sides, with Vader and some TIE fighters chasing him down from behind. Luke has almost no freedom here, almost no options, no space to maneuver in. And if this weren't enough, Luke is supposed to follow the instructions of his navigation computer. There's hardly any room in this picture for human choice. And suddenly, Luke hears a voice telling him to trust the Force. So Luke takes control of his situation and turns off the computer. But Vader still manages to lock onto him, and for a second the whole mission seems doomed, when suddenly Han Solo appears out of nowhere to save the day with another one of his rash charges. In other words, Luke's trusting the Force helps, but in the end he couldn't have pulled it off without Han. Up until this point, Han's just shoot it approach has been the foil to the Jedi approach, and in most cases, Han's approach hasn't worked all that well. Is this last contribution proof that there's something to Han's strategy after all? Or does Han pull this off partly because he's learned something from the others about the Jedi approach? He did offer Luke a parting, "May the Force be with you," before he took off. Maybe Han's changed, and it's the changed Han who can contribute to defeating the symbol of fear and unfreedom. On the other hand, Han's intervention here seems pretty similar to what we've seen from him all along. He just shows up, guns blazing, relying more on luck and surprise than strategy. The Jedi don't believe in luck, but does victory over the Empire simply require more luck than a Jedi is willing to admit? It certainly isn't Luke's skill with the Force alone that engineers this victory. Or is this a correction to the individualism implied by the thought that small, one-man fighters will save the day? The rebels had been working in teams until Luke lost his trench-run companions. If Luke had been able to blow up the Death Star with his companions gone, it would have been a resounding victory for the individual. Maybe Han's last-minute return also suggests that no matter how many Jedi tricks you have, you'll still need others. The ambiguities are multiplied by the awards ceremony at the end. A military ceremony is an unusual way to celebrate freedom from fear under a military-industrial order. As many have pointed out, the ceremony itself resembles a scene from Triumph of the Will, a famous Nazi documentary. Lucas would have been familiar with it from film school. It features a military rally that looks a lot like the ceremony at the end of A New Hope. Now, Lucas has at times wanted to downplay the similarity between these two rallies, but this is a side of the rebels that we haven't seen before. Rank upon rank of uniformed soldiers standing in identical parade rest posture and turning in locked step to face the front. And although we can still see their faces, and some of the uniforms have some color, it looks a lot more like what we've come to expect from the Empire. I think the scene raises a worthwhile question, a question we've been too busy enjoying the drama to ask ourselves. Can we really trust these rebels to replace the Empire with a free society? This scene reminds us that rebellions capable of taking down an empire require a certain amount of organization. And that organization may require some conformity, and even some uniformity. But forced conformity and uniformity were some of the main things we feared about the Empire. The whole thought behind small one-man fighters taking on the Death Star was the hope that individual freedom could triumph over institutionalized control. But here we are at the medal ceremony, seeing our individual heroes glorified by a very regimented organization. Is this what we were looking for? I like to think that a related problem is reflected in a fascinating bit of Death Star architecture. The power generator trench, where Obi-Wan finds the controls of the tractor beam. Now, from a practical standpoint, this architecture is utterly bizarre. Where should we put the controls for the tractor beam? Why not on an extremely narrow ledge hanging over a bottomless abyss? I mean, I'll give the architect credit. It seems like it would keep the stormtroopers from playing with the controls. But it seems to me that if this scene makes any real sense, it's a kind of symbolic sense. The Death Star's tractor beam is a kind of gravitational force that keeps ships like the Millennium Falcon from flying freely. And as we saw earlier, metaphorically, the Death Star's gravitational force is what keeps the various systems of the Empire in orbit. It's what maintains order. When you eliminate this force and the order it imposes, there's nothing to keep the systems under control, to keep them from flying off into the abyss. So how does Obi-Wan power the tractor beam down? He has to do it while standing on a narrow platform over the edge of the abyss. There's a very narrow space for maneuvering between rigid control and chaos. There's a grave risk in what the rebels are doing. The tyrannical order of the Empire could be replaced by a far worse anarchy. Obi-Wan knows how to turn off the tractor beam without losing his footing. But will the rebellion be able to pull off the same trick? In a book called The Movie Brats, Michael Pye and Linda Miles conclude that Star Wars offers the ultimate escape, withdrawal from complex questions of morality, and a display of magnificent fireworks as a bonus. It's a holiday from thought. What's interesting is that they notice the parallels to Triumph of the Will. But rather than interpret that scene as suggesting some nuance, they chalk those parallels up to incoherence. They decide in advance that Star Wars is vacuous, and when they see any evidence to the contrary, they say it doesn't make any sense. Star Wars is only a holiday from thought if you show up to it with a bathing suit and a beach towel. In this episode, we finally got to see how a Jedi Master approaches fear and the unfreedom it causes. We discussed Obi-Wan aboard the Death Star in his fight with Vader. We peeled back the layers of their duel, Vader's attempts to control Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan's resistance. And we fleshed out the Jedi approach by noting the importance of letting go of oneself. I then illustrated the same principles with examples from Lucas's life, and I concluded by considering the ambiguities at the end of the film. Having given you the big picture, next time I'll be able to fill in a few more details. As always, if you like the podcast, go ahead and subscribe, and pass the word along to anyone you think might be interested. May the Force be with you.